0027. On the 14th day of the concordance ceremony in the standard year 2687, a 61-year-old human woman walked to the center of the Hall of Concordance carrying a piece of broken iron. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten anyone. She did not bring a guard, an escort, or a single ceremonial attendant from her homeworld. She walked alone across a floor of polished blue crystal that had been laid down before her species had learned to write, and she set the iron down on the speaker's plinth as though she were setting down a cup of tea. The Pelisarn Tribunal had been ranking peace symbols for 4,000 years. They had silenced young civilizations, shamed proud ones, and reduced ambassadors to public weeping on at least 6 recorded occasions. They had never once been silenced themselves. They were silenced for 11 full minutes. This is the story of how Ambassador Mara Okonkwo broke a tradition older than human writing without raising her voice once. Before we go any further, comment where in the galaxy you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. To understand what happened in the hall, you have to understand the Vothic archives. And to understand the archives, you have to understand the human who walked into them. My name is Tomas Velen, Senior Archivist of the Third Concordance Cycle, and I am the Vothic who was assigned to catalog the human symbol the night before it changed the galaxy. I have spent 140 years of my life filing the deeds and dreams of other species into a system that has not failed me once. Until that night, Mara Okonkwo's pre-diplomatic record is unusually sparse for a concordance ambassador. She was born in Lagos in 2626, in the 3rd decade after the Reconstruction era. She trained as a conflict mediator in a school that no longer exists, in a building that was demolished the year she graduated. She worked for 31 years in regional dispute resolution on Earth and refused every off-world posting she was offered. Her file contains a gap of 14 months between 2658 and 2659 that no Vothic archivist has been able to fill. The Earth Records Office lists her as on personal leave. When she was asked about it during her concordance vetting, she said only that she had been learning something useful. She did not elaborate. We did not press. The Vothic do not press. We file what we are given and we make peace with what we are not. Humanity's entry into the galactic Concord 312 years earlier had been controversial. The vote had passed by a margin of 3 species. The objections, recorded in the concordance ledgers and still available to any archivist who cares to look, centered on a single concern raised by the Pelisarn Imperium and seconded by 4 of its client civilizations. The concern was this: humans, as a species, had spent the overwhelming majority of their recorded history doing violence to one another. They had enslaved their own kind. They had bombed their own cities. They had, within a single century, built weapons capable of ending their own biosphere, and then sat on those weapons for 80 years while arguing about who deserved to hold the trigger. The Pelisarn representative at the admission hearing had asked, with the kind of slow ceremonial dignity that the Pelisarn reserve for their most cutting questions, whether a species that had not yet made peace with itself could reasonably be expected to make peace with others. The human delegation had no good answer. They were admitted anyway, on a provisional rating, which is the lowest tier of full membership the Concord offers. They had remained on that rating for 3 centuries. The Concordance Registrar's data, which I have reviewed personally, confirms that in 4,000 years of symbol selection ceremonies, no younger species had ever received a first-rank rating. Provisional species were eligible to be elevated. None ever had been. The symbol selection itself deserves an explanation, because the rules of it are everything. Every 100 standard years, the 47 member species of the Concord gather in the Hall of Concordance on the neutral moon of Centaur. Each species presents one symbol, chosen by its own internal process, intended to represent that civilization's interpretation of peace. The symbols are presented in order of seniority, with the founding species presenting first and the most recently admitted species presenting last. The Pelisarn Tribunal then ranks each symbol on 3 criteria: harmony, aesthetic resolution, and what the Pelisarn call moral cleanliness. The rankings are public. They are broadcast across 47 systems. They are entered into the permanent Concord record, and they determine, more than any treaty or trade agreement, how each species is treated for the following century. A first-rank symbol elevates a species. A low rank diminishes one. A failed comprehension rating, which is the lowest possible result, can effectively end a young civilization's diplomatic standing for generations. The Pelisarn have weaponized this ceremony for as long as the ceremony has existed. They do not do so crudely. They do it through the language of art criticism, which is the cruelest language any species has ever invented, because it presents contempt as connoisseurship. Younger species, the Pelisarn have learned, almost always bring symbols of innocence. Doves, flowers, woven circles, children holding hands. The Pelisarn rank these symbols with the patient cruelty of a museum curator explaining to a child why their drawing is not, in fact, a masterpiece. They use words like naive sincerity and untested optimism and ceremonial earnestness. They smile while they do it. The smiles are recorded. The recordings are studied in diplomatic academies on a dozen worlds as examples of how to destroy a civilization without ever raising a weapon. The most famous Pelisarn victory was the ranking of the Thren delegation 600 years before Mara Okonkwo walked into the hall. The Thren had brought a singing crystal as their symbol of peace. It was a beautiful object. It produced a low, sustained tone when struck, and the tone had been calibrated by Thren musicians to resonate at the frequency of a contented infant's heartbeat. The tribune of that century, Vex Pelisarnkor's grandfather, examined the crystal for a full ceremonial hour. Then he addressed the assembled hall, and the recording of his speech still circulates in diplomatic training programs. He said the Thren had brought a lullaby to a council of adults. He said the crystal was lovely the way a child's nursery is lovely, and just as unsuited to the work of governance. He rated the symbol decorative, subordinate tier. The Thren never diplomatically recovered. Their delegation withdrew from the Concord within a decade, citing what they called irreconcilable aesthetic differences, which everyone understood to mean that they could no longer bear to sit in the same room as the species that had made their gift sound like a joke. They are still a member of the Concord, technically. They have not presented a symbol in 600 years. 3 months before Mara Okonkwo's ceremony, Earth Selection Committee met to choose humanity's symbol. The shortlist leaked to the Vothic archives, as such things always do, and I have the original document in my personal file. The candidates were these: an olive branch grown in lunar soil, harvested from the first orchard humans had successfully cultivated off Earth. A scale model of the Lagos Children's Hospital, which had been the first major construction project completed during the Reconstruction. A single seed from the oldest surviving tree of the Sahara Restoration, sealed in a crystal sphere. Each of these symbols had been chosen by a subcommittee. Each had been argued for at length. Each was, by the standards of every previous concordance ceremony, a perfectly defensible choice. They were beautiful. They were hopeful. They were the kind of symbol the Pelisarn had been humiliating for 4,000 years. Mara Okonkwo, as ranking ambassador for the ceremony, possessed a single override authority. She could reject the committee's chosen symbol and submit her own, with no requirement to consult, explain, or justify. The authority had been written into the ambassadorial charter generations earlier as a safeguard against committee paralysis, and no ambassador had ever invoked it. Mara invoked it. She rejected all 3 shortlisted symbols by formal letter on the first day of the 3rd month before the ceremony, and she submitted her own choice in a sealed crate that she carried personally from Lagos to Sintar. The committee was furious. They held an emergency session. They drafted a motion to recall her and replace her with the deputy ambassador. The motion failed by 1 vote. The deciding vote was cast by an elderly committee member named Dr. Adiz Nwasu, who had been Mara's teacher in the Lagos Mediation School 40 years earlier. Dr. Nwasu offered no public explanation for her vote. She said only in the committee chamber that she trusted Mara, and that if Mara had chosen to break with the committee's recommendation, the committee should at least give her the dignity of finding out why. The motion failed. Mara kept her authority. The crate traveled to Centaur unopened. I should now introduce Tribune Vex Pelisarncore, because the next part of this story is the part where he becomes important. Vex was 340 standard years old at the time of the ceremony, which in Pelisarn terms placed him in the prime of his judicial career. His grandfather had ranked the Thren Crystal. His father had presided over the humiliation of the Corithi delegation, who had brought a flag in 2287 and been dismissed as tribal. Vex himself had personally raided 9 younger species during his tenure, none of them above the subordinate tier. He was, by every measure the Pelisarn use, an exemplary jurist. He was also bored. His tenure was approaching its statutory end. He had ranked enough symbols that the work no longer surprised him. He had, in the months before the ceremony, begun to express to his colleagues a wish for what he called a final case of consequence. He had received intelligence, through channels the Pelisarn maintain in every member species bureaucracy, that the human symbol was, in the words of his informant, unconventional. Vex had prepared accordingly. He had drafted a new ranking category specifically for the occasion. The category was called Failed Comprehension. It was reserved, in the language of his preparatory memo, for species who do not understand the question being asked. It had never been used in the Concord's history. Vex intended to use it on humanity. He had even drafted the speech he would give while doing so. The draft was preserved by his own clerks and entered, much later, into the Vothic archives as part of the formal record. It is a beautiful piece of writing. It is also one of the most ruthlessly contemptuous documents I have ever filed. It describes the human species as an adolescent civilization mistaking volume for substance, and it concludes with a line that Vex never got to deliver. We had hoped to welcome a peer. We have instead been asked to grade an essay. The evening before the ceremony, I was assigned to catalog the human symbol. This is standard procedure. Every symbol presented at the concordance must be entered into the Vothic archives the night before its public unveiling, with full provenance documentation, material analysis, and a preliminary classification. The work is usually routine. I have cataloged olive branches and crystal seeds and woven tapestries and ceremonial weapons that had been beaten into plowshares. I have a system. The system has not failed me in 140 years. I opened the human crate at the 19th hour of the evening cycle. Inside, packed in a single layer of unbleached cloth, was an iron chain link. It had been severed cleanly in 2 halves. The cut was old. The metal was pitted with the kind of corrosion that only develops over centuries. The 2 halves of the link were mounted on a piece of unworked stone, the kind of rough gray rock you might find in any quarry on any temperate planet. There was no inscription, there was no decorative element, there was no provenance documentation. There was only the chain, the stone, and a single line of text on a card tucked into the cloth, symbol of peace, submitted by the human delegation. I ran the symbol through the cataloging system. The system rejected it. I ran it again. Rejected. I ran it a 3rd time, adjusting the input parameters to allow for non-standard aesthetic categories. Rejected. I ran it a 4th time with every category override I had authority to apply. Rejected. The system was telling me, in the polite and ancient language of Vothic archival software, that the object I was trying to file was not a symbol of peace. It was a symbol of something else, and the system did not have a category for what that something else was. I sat in the archive at the 22nd hour with the chain on my desk and a cup of root tea cooling beside me, and I tried to think clearly. The Vothic are not philosophers. We are not artists. We are not warriors or diplomats or judges. We are archivists. Our work is the work of fitting things into systems. When a thing refuses to fit, we have only 2 options. We can declare the thing to be uncategorizable, which is a confession of professional failure. or we can invent a new category, which requires the authority of the senior archivist's office and the formal approval of the concordance registrar. Neither option is taken lightly. I was preparing to draft an uncategorizable object petition when I heard footsteps in the archive corridor. It was the third hour of the morning cycle. The archive was supposed to be empty. I looked up, and Mara Okonkwo was standing in the doorway, holding a small ceramic cup. She was wearing a simple gray robe. She had not slept. She looked, I noted in my private journal later, like someone who had been awake for a very long time and had made peace with it. She asked if she was disturbing me. I said no. She asked if I had opened the crate. I said yes. She asked if I had been able to file the symbol. I said no, and I explained the problem. I told her that my system was rejecting the object because it did not match any of the categories the system recognized for peace symbols. I told her that I was preparing to petition for a new category, and that I would need to know how she wanted the object described in the formal record. She walked into the archive. She set down her ceramic cup. She picked up the broken chain and turned it over in her hands the way someone might handle a photograph of a person they had loved and lost. She said, "Just file it under what it is." I said, "What is it?" She said, "You'll know tomorrow." She put the chain back on the stone. She picked up her cup. She walked out of the archive. I did not file the symbol that night. I sat with it until the morning cycle began, and then I carried it to the Hall of Concordance, and I placed it on the human delegation's plinth, and I went to my assigned observation gallery, and I waited to find out what I had been holding. The ceremony began at the 8th hour. The Hall of Concordance is shaped like a great inverted bowl, with the speaker's plinth at the bottom and the galleries rising in concentric rings around it. 47 species were present. Each delegation occupied a section of the gallery, with the founding species in the highest rings and the most recently admitted species at the bottom, closest to the floor. The human delegation, as the youngest provisional member, sat almost at floor level. Mara Okonkwo sat in the front row of her delegation, alone. Her two deputies sat one row behind her. She had asked for the seating arrangement specifically. The Pelisarn Tribunal occupied a raised dais on the opposite side of the floor from the speaker's plinth. Tribune Vex Pelisarncourt sat in the center seat, flanked by his two associate judges. He was wearing the ceremonial robes of his office, layered in genealogical embroidery that traced his lineage back 14 generations. He looked, I will admit, magnificent. The ceremony proceeded in the traditional order. The Pelisarn presented first, as the senior species, and their symbol was a perfect sphere of polished obsidian, which they described as representing the unbroken continuity of their civilization. It was rated first rank by acclamation, as it always is. The Thren passed, as they have for 6 centuries. The Korithi presented a flag and were rated decorative, subordinate tier. The Vothic presented a blank scroll, which we have presented at every concordance for 2,000 years, and which is always rated acceptable, reserved tier. We are archivists. We do not seek elevation. 43 more species presented in turn. 3 were elevated to acceptable. 2 were demoted to subordinate. The rest received their expected ratings with the calm dignity of civilizations that had long since stopped hopping for anything else. Humanity was called last. Mara Okonkwo stood. She did not look at her deputies. She did not look at the Pelisarn dais. She walked across the floor of the hall alone, and she stood beside the plinth where I had placed the broken chain that morning. Tribune Vex Pelisarncourt rose from his seat. He had his prepared speech in hand. He began to deliver it. He spoke for approximately 90 seconds in the slow ceremonial cadence of the Pelisarn High Court. He said that the human delegation had submitted a symbol of, in his words, considerable interpretive ambiguity. He said that the tribunal had been required, in the interests of fairness, to prepare a new ranking category for the occasion. He began to introduce the category of failed comprehension. He got as far as the word failed. Mara Okonkwo raised her hand. She did not raise her voice. She raised her hand, palm flat, fingers together, in the universal concordance gesture for "I wish to address the hall." The gesture has a formal name in the Concord's ceremonial protocols. It is called the right of direct address, and it can be invoked by any ambassador at any point during a symbol selection exactly once with no requirement of permission from the chair. It had been invoked twice in the previous 4,000 years. Tribune Vex stopped speaking. He had to. The protocol required it. He sat down. The hall went very quiet. Mara Okonkwo lowered her hand. She stepped to the plinth. She put one hand on the broken chain. She began to speak. She spoke for 11 minutes. I have the recording. I have transcribed it personally. I will not reproduce all of it here, because some of it was not meant for the Concord's general record, and Mara herself later requested that the full transcript be sealed for 100 years. But I will tell you what she said in substance, because the substance is what mattered. She said that humanity had spent most of its recorded history enslaving itself. She named the trade routes. She named the centuries. She named the ports of departure and the ports of arrival. She named the ships. She named by family her own ancestors on both sides of the chain. She had ancestors who had been captured. She had ancestors who had captured them. She said that this was not a metaphor. She said that the chain on the plinth in front of her was a real chain, recovered from a real ship, salvaged from real water off the coast of a real city that still bore the scars of what had happened there. She said that her ancestors on one side had been carried across an ocean in chains exactly like this one. She said that her ancestors on the other side had sold them. She said the word sold. She did not flinch. She said that her species had, over the course of the centuries that followed, fought wars to end this practice, then forgotten the wars, then fought new wars, then forgotten again. She said that her species had built peace not because they were good, but because they were tired. She said that peace, in her professional experience as a conflict mediator, was never the thing that arrived after the violence stopped. Peace was the thing that arrived when the people who had done the violence finally agreed to say what they had done, and the people who had survived it finally agreed to be witnessed. She said that the conquered had asked humanity for a symbol of peace. She said that humanity had been tempted to bring an olive branch, or a flower, or a child's drawing of a sunrise. She said that her committee had prepared exactly such symbols. She said that she had rejected them. She said that she had rejected them because she had spent 14 months of her life, in 2658 and 2659, working in a small archive in Lagos that catalogued the names of every human being who had been bought and sold during the 4 centuries of the Atlantic trade. She said that she had read 14 million names. She said that she had written each one of them out by hand, in a ledger that now lived in a museum on Earth that she would never visit again because she had given enough of herself to it already. She said that she had learned during those 14 months that a whole symbol is a lie. She said that a whole flower is not peace, because peace did not arrive whole. She said that a whole chain is not peace, because a whole chain is what bondage looks like. She said that peace is the moment a chain breaks, and the people who broke it admit they made it, and the people who carried it admit they survived it, and both of them agree in front of witnesses to build something different. She lifted the broken chain from the plinth. She held it up. She said, "We were asked for a symbol of peace. We brought you the only honest symbol we have. This chain was made by my ancestors. It was worn by my ancestors. It was broken by my ancestors. All of those things are true. All of those things are us. We do not bring you a symbol of what we wish we had been. We bring you a symbol of what we became because of what we did and what was done to us and what we finally decided to stop doing. If you cannot rank this, that is a problem with your ranking system. It is not a problem with our peace." She set the chain back down. She stepped away from the plinth. She walked back to her seat. She sat down. The hall went silent. The silence lasted 11 minutes. I timed it. I am Vothic, we time things. Tribune Vex Pelisarncore sat on his dais and did not move. His prepared speech was on the lectern in front of him. The word failed was the last word he had spoken. He could not deliver the rest of the speech. To rate the human symbol as failed comprehension was to claim that the humans had not understood the question. They had clearly understood the question. They had understood it better than the tribunal had. They had understood that the question was not, "What is your idea of peace?" but "What proof of peace can you offer?" and they had offered proof so specific, so material, and so unflinching that no other answer in the hall could stand beside it without looking decorative. To rate the human symbol as first rank was to acknowledge, in the permanent concordance record, that a provisional species had brought a symbol of peace more honest than the obsidian sphere the Pelisarn had presented for 4,000 years. It was to admit that the Pelisarn's own symbol, the perfect unbroken sphere of their unbroken continuity, was a different kind of lie. It was to admit that the conquered had spent 4 millennia rewarding civilizations for their ability to pretend they had never been damaged, when in fact every civilization in the hall had been damaged, and the only one that had been willing to say so out loud was the youngest. There was no third option. Vex sat on his dais. His 2 associate judges looked at him. He did not look back. After 11 minutes he stood. He said that the tribunal would recess to deliberate. He said that the deliberation would be conducted in private chambers in accordance with the Concord's emergency procedures. He left the dais. The associate judges followed. The hall remained seated for another 40 minutes in case the tribunal returned. The tribunal did not return. The session was suspended at the 14th hour. It did not resume that day. The next morning, the Concord's Secondary Council, which has the authority to issue rulings in the event of a tribunal recess, issued humanity a first-rank rating for its symbol. The vote was 11-2, with the Pelisarn delegation abstaining. It was the first time in 4,000 years that a provisional species had been elevated through the symbol selection. The Pelisarn boycotted the ceremony's closing rites. Tribune Vex Pelisarncourt submitted his resignation within the standard week, citing what his official letter described as an irreconcilable difference of interpretation regarding the foundational premises of the tribunal's work. He retired to his family estate. He has not spoken publicly since. 3 younger species petitioned the Concord for re-evaluation of their own symbols within the year. 2 of them, the Corithi and a species called the Helvar, were granted re-evaluations and presented new symbols. The Corithi brought a torn flag, mended with thread of a different color, and were elevated to acceptable. The Helvar brought a piece of broken pottery, glued back together with visible seams of gold, in a technique they said they had learned from a human textbook they had not previously thought to read. They were elevated to first rank. The Thren, after 600 years of silent membership, sent a delegation to the next concordance and presented a symbol of their own, their original singing crystal, now deliberately cracked. It was rated first rank by acclamation. I filed all of these. I had to invent a new catalog classification to do it. I called the classification Honest Symbols. The broken chain was its first entry. I petitioned for the classification on the morning after Mara Okonkwo's speech, and the concordance registrar approved it within the hour, which is the fastest classification approval in the recorded history of the Vothic archives. My system, after 140 years, had finally been given the category it had been missing. I have used it 43 times since. Mara Okonkwo retired from diplomatic service 3 months after the ceremony. She refused every interview request for the rest of her life. She returned to Lagos. She lived in a small apartment near the archive where she had spent her missing 14 months. She died in 2701 at the age of 75 of natural causes. In her own bed. Her funeral was attended by 200 people, almost all of them former colleagues from the Lagos Mediation School. The Concord sent a delegation. The delegation was not allowed inside the building. Her family said she had asked specifically for a private ceremony, and the Concord representatives waited outside in the rain and then went home. The broken chain was installed in the permanent gallery of the Hall of Concordance 1 year after the ceremony. It is mounted on the same piece of unworked stone Mara brought with her from Earth. The placard beside it bears only her name, the date, and the words she said when I asked her what the symbol was. File it under what it is. Every century since, new species arriving for admission to the Concord have been walked past the chain before they are walked anywhere else. This is now standard protocol. It is the first thing they see. They are not told what it is. They are not told who brought it. They are given time to look at it and then they are taken to their delegation chambers and asked, in private, what they think peace means. The answers are recorded in the Vothic archives. I have read all of them. They are not the same answers the conquered used to receive. Mara Okonkwo was not the most celebrated ambassador in human history. She was not the longest serving. She was not the most decorated. She refused promotion her entire career and accepted exactly one off-world posting, the one that took her to Seen Tar for a single ceremony, and she never traveled off-world again. She gave one speech that mattered. She spoke for 11 minutes. She walked back to her seat. But she understood something that the Pelisarn, in their 4,000 years of unbroken continuity, had never allowed themselves to understand. She understood that peace is not the absence of damage. Peace is what damaged people build because they remember. A whole symbol of peace is a symbol of a peace that was never tested, and a peace that was never tested is not peace. It is luck. It is privilege. It is the silence of a civilization that has not yet been required to explain itself. Humanity did not bring peace to the conquered because they had achieved it. They brought peace because they had bled enough to know what it costs. They had counted their own dead. They had named their own crimes. They had broken their own chains, and they had kept the pieces because the pieces were the proof. A whole symbol can be a lie. A broken one cannot. I am Tomas Velen. I have catalogued 43 honest symbols in the years since Mara Okonkwo walked into the hall. The broken chain is still the first one. It will be the first one for as long as the conquered exists. And every century, when new species arrive at Seen Tar and are walked past it for the first time, I am there in the gallery watching them look. They always stop. They always read the placard. They always ask eventually what it means. And I always tell them the same thing. I tell them what Mara told me in the archive at the 3rd hour of the morning with a cup of cooling tea between us. I tell them, it is what it is. And then I tell them, you will know tomorrow. If this story kept you watching, hit subscribe and catch the next one.